The steam from my coffee rose in a slow, ghostly spiral. I watched my 3 children through the glass door. They moved with a quiet, synchronized grace. My parents told me I was a terrible mother, that I didn't even know how to raise my own children. I will never forget that moment. The memory tastes like copper and cold rain. It sits in my throat whenever I hear my sister's car. Jessica's tires always crunched the gravel with a violent, possessive authority. The engine died with a sharp metallic click. Jessica stepped out, adjusting her blazer like armor. She marched toward the house, her shadow long and jagged. Behind her, young Leo dragged his feet. He looked like a soldier heading toward a court-martial. Jessica didn't wave or smile. She checked her watch, her jaw tight and square. I felt the old familiar pressure in my chest. She was coming to inspect the life she predicted would fall apart years ago. She entered without knocking, bringing the scent of expensive perfume and cold air. Her eyes swept the room like a searchlight. She lingered on a stray toy near the sofa. To Jessica, a mess was a moral failing. We stood in the kitchen, the air thick and electric. I offered tea, but she just stared at my youngest daughter. Jessica's hands were clasped firmly behind her back. She looked for a crack in my composure. Then she noticed the silence. "It is too quiet in here," Jessica said. Her voice was a low, dangerous vibration. She turned to Leo, who was standing frozen by the door. She barked an order about his posture. The boy flinched, his eyes darting toward my son. My children continued their game, unaware of the storm. Jessica's face tightened with a flicker of genuine confusion. She couldn't understand how they functioned without a constant threat. Her fingers twitched against her sleeve as if she were reaching for a ruler. We walked toward the backyard to watch the boys play. The grass was vibrant under the harsh afternoon sun. My son offered Leo a truck, but Leo gripped it too hard. His knuckles were white. Jessica leaned in, whispering about discipline and the necessity of fear. I kept my voice steady and soft. I explained that we prefer understanding over force. She laughed, a short and bitter sound that cut the air. She called my kindness a slow poison. Her son began to growl. The scream shattered the afternoon peace. Leo had thrown the truck, his face a mask of sudden, jagged rage. He lunged at my son with his small fists clenched. Jessica didn't move to help. She just crossed her arms. Her eyes gleamed with a dark, triumphant light. She waited for me to fail. I stepped toward the boys, my heart hammering against my ribs. The neighbor, Mrs. Anderson, was already watching from the fence. She looked like she had seen a ghost. I knelt beside the boys as the red plastic truck lay upside down. My son rubbed his shoulder but didn't cry. Leo's chest heaved with a frantic, jagged rhythm. Jessica remained standing on the patio, her shadow cutting across the grass. She didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. Her eyes stayed locked on me, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and impending disaster. I didn't yell. I sat on the grass and looked at Leo. He expected a blow or a scream. His small shoulders were hiked up to his ears. "That was a big feeling, Leo," I said quietly. He blinked, his confusion momentarily overriding his rage. Jessica scoffed from the porch, the sound sharp as a razor. She wanted me to be the monster she claimed I was. My son reached out to touch Leo's arm. Mrs. Anderson stepped closer to the white picket fence. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the wood. "I have to say something," she started, her voice trembling. Jessica straightened her spine, her expression hardening into a defensive mask. The neighbor looked directly at my sister with a heavy, pained stare. "I've been watching from my window all afternoon." My heart skipped a beat. The neighbor's gaze was clinical and cold. The neighbor described how Leo had hit her granddaughter earlier that morning. Jessica's face went from pale to a deep, bruised crimson. She tried to interrupt, but Mrs. Anderson held up a weathered hand. "But this one," she said, gesturing to my son. He was the one who shared. He gave her a hug. The praise felt like a physical weight in the yard. Jessica looked like she had been slapped. Her authority was rotting in public. Leo suddenly let out a high, thin wail. He scrambled toward Jessica's car, his sneakers skidding on the gravel. "I hate you, Mommy," he screamed. The words hung in the air like smoke. I wish I lived with Auntie instead. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jessica stood frozen as if her blood had turned to ice. Her son was finally speaking. Jessica didn't move toward the child. She turned on me, her eyes wild and bloodshot. "What have you been telling him?" she hissed. She marched across the lawn, her finger jabbing at my chest. She accused me of poisoning his mind with lies. My parents watched from the stairs, silent and paralyzed. I stepped back, my hands raised in a plea for peace. She wasn't seeing her son. She was seeing her own reflection and screaming. I looked at my nephew through the car window. He was pressed against the glass, his face wet with tears. He looked trapped. Jessica's husband finally stepped out of the driver's seat, his face a mask of exhaustion. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at me with a silent, desperate apology. Jessica was still screaming about my soft parenting and my weak heart. Then, the car door locked with a heavy, final thud. Leo had locked them out. The heavy click of the central locking system echoed like a gunshot. Jessica pulled at the door handle, her face contorting into a mask of pure disbelief. Leo stared back through the tinted glass, his expression hollow and unmoving. He sat in the center of the leather bench, clutching his seatbelt. My sister hammered on the window with her palm. The sound was dull and rhythmic. Behind us, my parents remained huddled on the porch steps. I moved toward the car, my hands open and visible. Jessica spun around, her eyes wide and wet. "Stay back," she warned, her voice cracking under the strain. I ignored the bite in her tone. I needed to reach the boy before she broke the glass. Her husband stood by the hood, fumbling with his phone. He looked broken and small. The power dynamic had shifted from the sisters to the silent child in the car. The heat was rising off the asphalt in shimmering waves. I tapped gently on the rear window. "Leo, it is okay," I whispered. I kept my movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at his mother. He looked at me, searching for the safety I had always promised. Jessica tried to shove me aside, but her strength was gone. She was trembling. The neighbor, Mrs. Anderson, finally turned away. She went inside her house. Suddenly, the locks whirred and the back door swung open. Leo didn't climb out. He sat there, waiting for the storm to break. Jessica lunged forward to grab his arm, but he flinched. It was a small movement, yet it stopped her cold. She realized he was terrified of her touch. I saw the moment her pride shattered into dust. "Jessica, stop," my father said. His voice was firm for the first time in years. He placed a hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off. She was looking at Leo's school bag on the floor. A crumpled, yellow slip peeked out from the side pocket. I reached for it before she could. It was another behavioral report from his teacher. The school wanted a mandatory meeting. This was the third incident in a single week. My mother took Leo's hand and led him toward the house. Jessica didn't follow them this time. She sat on the edge of the car seat and buried her face. Her husband finally spoke, his voice low and wary. "We cannot keep doing this, Jess," he said. He looked at me, then back at his wife. The air felt thin and cold despite the sun. A long-held family secret was bubbling to the surface. I walked back toward the house to check on my children. They were watching from the window, their faces pressed against the glass. I promised them everything would be fine, but I felt the lie. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Jessica's husband sent minutes ago. He had been recording the entire confrontation. He wanted proof for the therapist. He wasn't just tired, he was planning to leave her tonight. The sun dipped lower, casting long, bruised shadows across the driveway. I gripped my phone, the screen glowing with the husband's desperate text. Jessica remained huddled in the car, a fallen queen in a leather throne. My parents hurried Leo inside, their movements frantic and hushed. I had to stop the bleeding before the family shattered. I walked toward the driver's side, my shoes crunching on loose grit. The air smelled of exhaust and damp earth. Jessica looked up, her eyes rimmed with a raw, ugly red. "He is leaving me, isn't he?" she whispered. I didn't answer right away. The truth felt like a stone in my mouth. She saw the notification on my screen and lunged. Her fingernails scraped the plastic casing of my phone. We struggled for a moment in the cramped space. The power had fully shifted from her hands to mine. She was begging with her eyes. I stepped back, keeping the device out of her reach. "He is scared for Leo, Jess," I said. My voice was a flat, steady line. She climbed out of the car, her movements stiff and robotic. Her blazer was wrinkled, the buttons misaligned. She looked like the mess she always claimed I was. My father watched us from the porch, his face a pale moon. He looked older than he had an hour ago. The husband, Mark, walked toward us from the hood. He didn't look angry, he looked finished. He reached for Jessica's keys on the roof. "I am taking him to my mother's house," he said. Jessica let out a sound like a wounded animal. It was a low, guttural moan that made my skin crawl. The neighbors' lights began to flicker on down the street. We were a public spectacle. The shame was finally hers. I stepped between them, my pulse thrumming in my ears. "Wait until tomorrow," I pleaded. Mark shook his head, his jaw set in a hard, stubborn line. He was done waiting for the storm to pass. He wanted to save the boy from the wreckage. Jessica reached out to touch his arm, but he flinched away. It was a mirror of Leo's earlier fear. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. My mother reappeared at the door, her hands trembling. "Leo won't stop crying," she called out. The sound of his distress drifted through the screen door. It was a high, jagged wail that cut through the tension. Jessica turned toward the house, her face twisting with sudden clarity. She wasn't the victim here. She was the architect of this grief. She took a single, hesitant step toward the porch. The silence felt like a trap. Mark didn't stop her, but he didn't follow either. He turned to me and handed me a small, leather-bound book. "She has been writing in this," he muttered. I took it, the cover feeling cold and heavy. I flipped to a random page and saw my own name. It wasn't a diary of hate. It was a ledger of every time she felt inadequate. Jessica hadn't been judging me. She was documenting her own slow, silent drowning. I tucked the leather-bound ledger under my arm, the weight of Jessica's hidden insecurities pressing into my ribs. The evening air had turned brittle and sharp. Mark stood by the car, his hand hovering over the door handle. He was a man prepared to vanish into the night. Inside the house, Leo's wails had subsided into a rhythmic, haunting sob. My objective was simple: keep this family from dissolving on my driveway. I walked toward my sister, who remained frozen on the porch. Jessica didn't look at me as I approached the stairs. She was staring at a chip in the white paint of the railing. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. "I wrote those things because I couldn't breathe," she whispered. Her voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I opened the book to a page dated 3 years ago. The handwriting was cramped and frantic. It detailed a night she had cried because Leo wouldn't sleep. She had felt like a total failure. Mark cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the quiet neighborhood. "The school called again while we were driving here," he said. Jessica finally turned her head, her eyes wide with a new brand of terror. The school wasn't just requesting a meeting anymore. They were reporting a physical altercation with a staff member. The news hit like a physical blow. Jessica slumped against the doorframe, her strength evaporating. Her militant success was officially a public disaster. I stepped closer, placing a hand on the cold wood beside her. "We can fix this, Jess," I said. My voice was the only steady thing left. She looked at me, her face a mask of raw, bleeding honesty. For a decade, she had used her age as a weapon. Now, she looked like a lost child. My father opened the screen door, his face grim. He held out a glass of water, but his hand was shaking visibly. The family foundation was crumbling. He hit a teacher. Jessica asked, her voice rising to a thin, panicked peak. Mark nodded slowly, his face devoid of any comfort. He reached into the car and pulled out a small suitcase I hadn't noticed before. He had packed before they even arrived. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst, it was a calculated exit strategy. My mother appeared behind my father, clutching a damp cloth. She looked at Jessica with a mixture of pity and deep, unspoken disappointment. It was agonizing. I turned to Mark, blocking his path to the driver's seat. "Give her 1 week of therapy," I bargained. He paused, his gaze flickering toward the house where his son was hiding. He looked at the ledger still clutched in my hand. He knew the secrets inside were the only map back to his wife. Jessica walked down the steps, her movement slow and cautious. She reached out toward Mark, but didn't touch him. She was learning the cost of her own rigid shadows. Mark sighed, a long sound that carried the weight of a dying marriage. He threw the suitcase back into the trunk with a heavy thud. 1 week? He muttered, pointing a finger at Jessica. "But you stay with Samantha." My heart stopped. Jessica looked at me, the old pride flickering for a second before dying out. She had to move into the house she had spent years mocking. Then, Leo stepped out onto the porch. He was holding my son's hand and shivering. The arrangement was a fragile truce etched in the dust of my driveway. Jessica stood by my guest room window, watching the rain blur the suburban landscape. She had been in my house for exactly 48 hours. The silence between us was heavy and thick like wet wool. Every time I moved a dish, she flinched. She was waiting for me to gloat or preach. I simply kept the coffee hot and the house quiet. Her son, Leo, remained barricaded in the playroom with my children. He was quiet. My primary objective was to get Leo back into a classroom without another violent outburst. The school principal had called twice this morning. Each ring of the phone felt like a physical strike against Jessica's remaining pride. She refused to answer the calls herself. She sat at my kitchen table, staring at the grain of the wood. Her hands were folded so tightly her knuckles looked like polished stones. I finally picked up the receiver on the third attempt. The news was not good. The school board was meeting at noon. The principal's voice was a dry, wary drone over the speaker. He explained that the teacher Leo hit was taking a leave of absence. Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This wasn't just a playground scuffle anymore. It was a liability for the district. I looked at the leather ledger on the counter. It was the only thing that could explain the boy's internal pressure. We needed a specialist, and we needed one immediately. Jessica began to weep. It was a silent, gut-wrenching sound of total defeat. I grabbed my keys and pointed toward the door. "We are going to the school," I said. My voice was firm, leaving no room for her standard protests. Jessica didn't move at first. She looked at her reflection in the darkened toaster. She saw a woman who had lost her son's trust and her husband's respect. Finally, she stood up and grabbed her coat. We left the kids with my husband and drove through the gray downpour. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm. The tension in the car was suffocating. At the school, the hallway smelled of floor wax and old sandwiches. We sat outside the office on small plastic chairs. Jessica kept smoothing her skirt, a nervous habit that betrayed her inner chaos. The power balance shifted when the school counselor stepped out. She didn't look at Jessica with judgment. She looked at her with profound, professional pity. "Leo is not a bad kid," she whispered. Jessica's head snapped up. It was the first time someone had validated the boy instead of the rules. The counselor led us into a small room filled with beanbags and posters. She pulled out a folder of Leo's drawings. They were dark, filled with jagged red lines and heavy black borders. In the center of every page was a small figure behind bars. Jessica touched the paper with a trembling finger. "Hay feels like he is in prison," she realized. Her voice was barely a breath. The counselor nodded slowly. The militant structure hadn't provided safety, it had created a cage. The truth was finally undeniable. We spent an hour discussing a new behavioral intervention plan. It required Jessica to attend daily sessions on emotional regulation. She had to learn how to speak without shouting. I watched her take notes with the intensity of a drowning person grabbing a rope. The counselor mentioned that Leo's aggression was a mirror of the home environment. Jessica didn't get defensive this time. She just listened. She looked at me, searching for a sign of support. I nodded. We were finally on the same side of the war. As we walked back to the car, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Jessica stopped near a puddle and turned to me. "I need to apologize to that teacher," she said. Her eyes were clear for the first time in years. It was an irreversible decision to take full accountability. She wasn't blaming the school or the soft world anymore. She was looking at her own hands. I felt a surge of genuine hope. Then, my phone buzzed with a frantic text from Mark. He had found something else. The text contained a photo of a hidden vent in Leo's bedroom. Inside the vent, the boy had stashed dozens of broken toys. They weren't just broken, they were systematically dismantled. Mark said the boy had been doing this for months in total silence. It was a secret ritual of destruction fueled by suppressed rage. My stomach dropped as I showed the image to Jessica. She turned white. We realized the anger hadn't just been directed outward. Leo was preparing for something much larger and much more dangerous tonight. The image of the dismantled toys on my phone screen felt like a physical weight. Jessica stared at the shattered plastic and jagged metal, her breath hitching in her throat. We raced back to my house, the tires splashing through deep, muddy puddles. My objective was to find Leo before his internal pressure cooked into something irreversible. Mark's truck was already idling in my driveway, his headlights cutting through the dusk. He looked like a man who had seen too much. The front door was wide open. We found Mark in the hallway, his face a ghostly shade of gray. He held a heavy, blackened lighter he had found in the guest room. It wasn't mine, and it certainly wasn't my husband's. Jessica collapsed against the wall, her legs finally giving out. The militant order she had forced upon her son had only taught him how to hide his fire. "Where is he?" Jessica choked out, her voice a thin, ragged whisper. Mark pointed toward the backyard. The tall grass was swaying in the wind. I ran past them, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The backyard was a sea of shifting shadows and damp cedar. I saw a small, dark shape huddled near the old wooden shed. Leo was sitting on the ground, surrounded by a ring of dry kindling. He wasn't crying anymore. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring at a small pile of paper. I realized with a jolt of horror that they were his old, strict chore charts. He was holding a match. I slowed my pace, dropping to my knees a few feet away. I didn't want to spook him into a sudden, frantic action. "Leo." "It is okay," I said, my voice barely a murmur. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the true depth of his exhaustion. He wasn't trying to be bad. He was trying to delete the person his mother had forced him to be. Jessica appeared at the edge of the patio, frozen in a silent, terrified prayer. The power balance shifted when Leo held the match out toward me. He wasn't threatening me. He was offering me the burden. "I don't want to be perfect anymore," he said. His voice was steady, which made it far more chilling than a scream. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I closed them over the small wooden stick. I blew it out, the thin trail of smoke rising into the cold night air. Jessica let out a sob that sounded like a breaking bone. I stood up and pulled the boy into a tight, protective embrace. He didn't flinch this time. He buried his face in my sweater and finally let go. The jagged, terrifying rage dissolved into the heavy sobs of a tired 7-year-old. Jessica walked forward, her movements slow and deliberate. She knelt in the mud and reached out for his hand. She didn't grab or pull. She just waited. It was the first time I had ever seen her offer him a choice. Leo eventually reached back, his small fingers lacing through hers. Mark joined them, his hand resting on Jessica's shoulder in a tentative show of support. The family was a broken, messy heap on my lawn. We stayed there for a long time as the rain began to fall again. The fire hadn't started, but the old world had certainly burned down. I looked at the shed and saw a final, unsettling detail. The faded red paint on the wood seemed to glow in the dark. We moved back inside, the house feeling strangely quiet and hollow. My husband had taken my children to the park to keep them away from the wreckage. Jessica sat Leo on the sofa and began to strip off his wet socks. She was focused, her movements gentle and rhythmic. The husband, Mark, watched them from the kitchen doorway. He still had his keys in his hand. He wasn't sure if he should stay. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp wool. Jessica looked at me, a silent question in her tired eyes. I knew what she needed. She needed me to tell her she wasn't a monster. I walked over and handed her the leather ledger I had been carrying. "Read the last page," I said. I had written a note there, while she was at the school. It was a list of all the times I had seen her try. Her face softened as she read my messy handwriting. The cycle of judgment was finally over. As the night deepened, a sense of fragile peace settled over the room. Jessica and Mark agreed to start family therapy the following morning. They were going to move back home, but with a completely different set of rules. I walked them to the door, feeling the weight of the week lift. But as Jessica buckled Leo into his seat, she stopped and frowned. She looked at the porch light of the neighbors. Mrs. Anderson was standing there, pointing at a black car idling down the street. The black car sat idling, its exhaust a faint plume in the cold moonlight. Mrs. Anderson signaled frantically from her porch, her eyes wide with a new alarm. Jessica gripped the car door, her knuckles turning a sharp, skeletal white. My objective was simple. Get them away before the past caught up. I stepped into the street, my pulse thrumming against my throat. The driver's side window slid down with a slow, electric hiss. I saw a face I had not seen in years. My father sat behind the wheel of his own car, having slipped away from the house while my mother stayed with Leo. He looked at Jessica, then at the suitcase still sitting in Mark's trunk. The power balance shifted as he turned off the ignition. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. He wasn't here to comfort us. He was here to enforce the very rules that had broken my sister. He stepped out, his boots clicking on the pavement. "You are making a mistake, Jessica," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He ignored me completely, focusing his cold gaze on the boy in the back seat. Leo shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. The militant legacy didn't start with Jessica. It started with the man standing in my driveway. I realized then that my sister was just a mirror of his iron will. She looked at him with a child's terror. Her hard-won progress began to flicker and fade. I stepped between them, my shadow falling across my father's polished shoes. I told him he wasn't welcome to interrupt this healing. He laughed, a dry sound that lacked any warmth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, yellowed photograph. It showed a young Jessica standing beside a broken toy, her face bruised. The secret was out. He had been the architect of her pain long before she was a mother. The cycle was deeper than I ever imagined. Jessica took a step forward, her voice finally finding its strength. "I am done being afraid of you," she said. It was an irreversible moment of clarity. She didn't shout or scream. She spoke with the quiet authority I had used with my own children. My father's face contorted, his mask of control finally slipping. He saw that he no longer held the leash. He turned back to his car without another word. The engine roared to life, and he sped away into the darkness. We stood together in the quiet night, the air finally clearing. Jessica hugged me, her grip fierce and honest. She buckled Leo in and looked at me one last time. The truth was finally clear: she wasn't a terrible mother, just a hurt child. They drove away, their taillights fading into the distance. I walked back to my porch and found a small, wooden match on the top step. Leo had held the matches in the yard, but the single stick on my porch was a fresh, cold warning. My father was still watching from the shadows of his own making.